Okay, it looks like we have reached 10 o'clock, so we will get started here. I would like to welcome you to the Bidders Conference for the Tribal Youth Diversion Program. And seeing how we have only one person here in the room, I'd like to invite you to go ahead and move up to the table there so you'll have a place to write and be a little closer to us. You're welcome. Thanks for joining us. We are also live streaming this today, and I believe we have one person currently on live stream. There is a chat function that's available for live streamers, and I'd like to ask the person who's online to please send us a note to let us know if you can see and hear us okay. We'll give a minute for that. And in the meantime, I have pulled up the first slide here for us, which is the agenda. And so for today, what we're going to do with the Bidders Conference is do some quick introductions to get started, and then I'll provide a general high-level summary of the grant, talk a little bit about the committees who were responsible for developing the request for proposal, go into detail on the proposal rating process, as well as the proposal instructions, go over a few key dates, and then talk about how we'll handle questions. So to start out with, I am Kimberly Bouchard. I'm the lead field rep for the Youth Reinvestment Grant overall, and that includes the Tribal Youth Diversion Program. I work in the Corrections Planning and Grant Programs Division.
Hi, everyone. I'm Isabel Diaz. I'm the analyst for the program.
Good morning. My name is Helene Zentner. I'm a field representative with the BSCC in the Grants Program Unit.
Good morning. My name is Tony Jackson, and I work in the Research Unit.
I'm off camera, but my name is Sean Moore. I'm with BSCC IT.
Hi, this is Kat. I'm from IT.
And would you mind introducing yourself too?
Hi, my name is Sarah McDonald. I work for California Indian Manpower Consortium as the Customer Relationship Management Systems Operator, and we are a consortium of California tribes.
Great. Thank you for being here today. How's it looking in terms of the live stream? Okay, excellent. So we will move on. So the Tribal Youth Diversion Program is part of a youth reinvestment grant that was established during the budget development process last summer. The Tribal Youth Diversion Program is only one component within that larger grant, but there is a dedicated $1,119,000 specifically for California Indian tribes. And that funding is to be used for diversion programs for Indian children. The legislation directs that any programs that are funded out of this grant should be trauma-informed, community-based, and health-based. The eligible applicants for this grant are federally recognized tribes, and in terms of the funding request, there is no minimum or maximum amount that an applicant can request. It's also possible for applicants to submit multiple applications, and they can also submit regional applications in conjunction with one or more other tribes. And in the case of the regional applications, I do want to point out that the tribal advisory group that worked on developing this request for proposal felt that it was really a positive thing for tribes to be working together and chose to assign preference points for proposals that do include a consortium of tribes. In this case, the successful applicants will be funded for a total of 3 years, and we are expecting that to begin on July 1 of this year and run through June 30th of 2022. The target population for this grant program is Indian children who are under 18 years of age who are facing entry to the juvenile justice system or further deeper involvement in that system. And the idea was to target Indian children who are living in areas where they experience high rates of juvenile arrests, high rates of suicide, high rates of alcohol and substance abuse, and low high school graduation rates. There were a couple of things that the Tribal Advisory Group talked about in terms of what these diversion programs for Indian children need to look like. And the legislation talks about the programs being trauma-informed, and it talks about them being health-based. But in this case, given the particulars for this population that's going to be served, the advisory group felt that it was important to specify that trauma-informed diversion services under this grant must be sensitive to the issues of historical trauma. And likewise, health-based approaches that are funded under this grant must be grounded in an overall wellness approach. The BSCC relies on an executive steering committee process in order to do our grant development work. And in this case, there was a 14-member executive steering committee that was appointed for the Youth Reinvestment Grant overall. Those 14 members represent various disciplines and various communities throughout our state. And as is always the case, we select a BSCC board member to be the chair, or in this case, we actually had co-chairs. So we had board members David Steinhardt and Mark Varela serve as the co-chairs for this executive steering committee. And if you're interested in seeing the full roster, that is included in the RFP on page 38. One of the important things to note here for this particular ESC, because there was this separate funding dedicated to Indian children that was in the legislation, the ESC looked at that and felt that it was important to designate a tribal advisory group to ensure that we had the appropriate level of expertise in developing the request for proposals specifically for this tribal youth diversion program. So they did, in fact, develop a tribal advisory group, and it was comprised of 5 tribal experts with broad experience. That advisory group was chaired by Olin Jones, and the full roster for that body is also in the RFP and can be located at page 39. So a couple things to keep in mind about the work of these executive steering committees, or in this case, the Tribal Advisory Group. Their role is really critical to this grant work that we do here at the BSCC. In this case, the Tribal Advisory Group worked on developing the RFP that we have in front of us today. Once we receive proposals, they will be the readers and raters of those proposals, and ultimately they will develop the award recommendations that go forward to our BSCC board for consideration and approval. So given the role that they play in this grant development work, we always make note of the fact that the individuals who serve on the BSCs, or in this case on the advisory group, are subject to conflict of interest policies, and our policy prohibits anyone who participated in the Tribal Advisory Group from receiving funding through this grant. Okay, so beginning with the next slide, I'm going to use the PowerPoint to help walk us through some specific components of the RFP. But before we do that, I want to pause just for a minute and ask if there are any questions either in the room or on the live stream. And I would note that for the sake of the recording and to ensure that anybody on the live stream can hear everything that goes on here, if you have anything to add, Sarah, I would ask you to use your microphone. And then for the live streamers, if you would please just type in any questions you have in the chat box, and we can read those aloud here. Yes.
For tribal youth, does it specify, is it only on reservation or can it be both on and off reservation?
It does not specify, so that is open. Anything?
No online questions.
Okay, then we will move forward. So we are now on slide 9, and looking at this slide, one thing I want to point out with this next set of slides, we do have a reference at the bottom of the page, so if you've got your RFP in front of you, you can follow along with the page numbers that are there. Okay, so looking first and foremost, when are these proposals due? They are due to us by 5 p.m. on March 29th, 2019. And we do need 2 things from each applicant. We need an original signed proposal packet, so that's a hard copy that you'll send to us in the mail with an original signature. And we also need 1 electronic copy. Again, it should be a signed copy, but it could be a PDF of the packet that's prepared before you drop it in the mail. Now, for the 5 p.m. due date on March 29th, we only have to receive one of those 2, either the hard copy or the electronic copy, and the other one can follow 2 or 3 days behind. But in terms of meeting that hard deadline of 5 p.m. on March 29th, we do need to have one of the 2 in-house. And then I've also put our dedicated mailbox address on the bottom of the screen there, Youth Reinvestment Grant at bscc.ca.gov. That is where the electronic copies should be sent to. Okay. And I also want to ask that when you submit your hard copies, please just use a binder clip on them and send them in. I would ask that they not be sent in binders or that they be spiral bound or anything like that. It's really easiest for us to work with it if you just put a binder clip on it and send it in that way. All right, and then moving on to the next slide. I know we just talked about this a minute ago, but I just want to reiterate again, the only eligible applicants for this $1.1 million grant are federally recognized Indian tribes in California. Now, I want to also talk about one thing in particular here. There are some presumptions built into the eligible applicant piece of this grant and RFP. When you look at the statute, it specifically talks about these funds being meant to target areas with high rates of juvenile arrest, high rates of suicide, high rates of alcohol and substance abuse, and lower than average high school graduation rates. When the Tribal Advisory Group met and looked at this criteria and worked on the grant development, they considered the data that exists for tribes, for Indian children and communities, and came to the conclusion that really they are all facing these kinds of rates. So a presumption is built into this from the beginning that every tribe already meets this criteria and is therefore eligible to apply for this funding. Before I move on, are there any questions on that piece? Okay, very good. So then we know now that the tribes are going to be the only entities who are eligible to apply for these funds. But when we talked about this and the advisory group looked at it, it's quite likely that tribes won't have the capacity to be the service providers on their own. So we are anticipating that tribes will need to work with non-governmental organizations in order to actually provide the diversion services that are envisioned by this grant. So I want to go over here the criteria that the BSCC has for the non-governmental organizations that receive grant funding as sub-grantees. It would apply also if they were receiving them as direct grantees. But in this case, since we know that can't happen, I'm using the terminology sub-grantee. Okay, so for any NGO that may be sub-grantee of a tribe, they would need to be duly organized, in existence, and in good standing for at least 6 months. They need to be registered with the California Secretary of State, if applicable, and they need to have a valid business license if it's required by their applicable local jurisdiction. They would also need to have any other licenses or certifications that are necessary to provide the services requested, and they need to have an address. All right, so then moving on from there, the next part of the RFP talks about the letters of intent. And we are in this grant asking for prospective applicants to submit letters of intent to apply by February 20th of 2019. Those letters of intent are non-binding. If a tribe were to submit a letter of intent and later decide that they don't want to apply, they would in no way be penalized for that. And similarly, if an applicant does not submit a letter of intent, but later on decides that they would like to apply, they can do so. And I want to encourage these letters of intent. They aren't mandatory, but they are very helpful to us in planning for what to expect and what the workload's going to look like and what we need to prepare our tribal advisory group for in terms of the next phase of their work. So even if you can't make that February 20th due date, I highly encourage anyone who's thinking they're going to apply to submit a letter of intent to us. All right, so then looking at the specifics for this grant, the projects that are selected for funding will be funded for 3 years, and it is our expectation that that funding cycle will begin on July 1st of this year. The total funding that's available for the Tribal Youth Diversion Grant is $1,119,000. For any individual tribe who submits an application, there's no minimum and there's no maximum amount that can be requested. So that means that one tribe can request the entire $1,119,000 if they have a strong proposal that supports the expenditure at that level. Okay. For this grant, there is no match requirement. And for this grant, like all BSCC competitive grants, there is no supplanting of funds allowed. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to note on this slide is that as you look through this RFP, you will see that there's a lot of flexibility built into it. And that's because when the Tribal Advisory Group met and talked about it, they really wanted to make sure that there would be enough room for tribes to come in and tell their story, really to talk about what's going on in their community and what they identify as their need and as their proposal to address that need. So it really is pretty wide open for applicants to use the proposal narrative to define what diversion needs to look like. Okay, one of the project requirements for this grant is a bit of data collection and reporting. And the Tribal Advisory Group was careful to not make this terribly burdensome, but they also felt that it was critical to take the opportunity to collect some data. So we have 2 requirements that are presented on this slide. At the beginning of the process, once we have identified proposals that will be funded, each of those applicants, in this case tribes, will be asked to prepare a tribal project review plan. And that plan will need to identify goals and objectives for the grant, and it will also need to describe how effectiveness will be assessed over the course of the grant cycle. And then at the end of the 3-year grant cycle, tribes will also be asked to submit a tribal project review report. So this part would be looking at what happened during the 3 years that the project was implemented and describing whether or not the project was successful overall in meeting the goals. There are a number of other requirements tied to this grant, and it's a relatively long list. I'm not going to talk about it in too much detail, but all of this information on this slide and the next slide can be found on pages 9 through 13. And just quickly going through this list, each applicant that is selected for funding will enter into a formal grant agreement with the BSCC. Each applicant will need to submit a governing board or tribal council resolution. There's audit requirements tied to this, and that allow for auditing of records related to this grant for up to 3 years after the conclusion of the grant. A grantee orientation will be held for all applicants who are selected for funding, and that is anticipated to take place in late August or in September. We'll use that opportunity to go over in more detail with each grantee information about the invoicing and what to expect during the 3 years that you'll be implementing your program. The last bullet on this slide is funding disbursement, and I want to talk about this for a minute because it is a little bit of a unique funding structure that we're using for this grant. The applicants that are selected for funding will, once they have their grant agreement, within 45 days, they will be able to receive funding in advance of any expenditures. So we will disperse 1/3 of the total grant award up front, and then once 80% of that initial disbursement has been spent down, we will disperse the next 1/3 of the grant award, and then once 80% of the total award amount has been spent, we would disperse the final 1/3. I said that wrong. So once 80% of the 2/3 has been spent, we will disperse the final 1/3. Okay. And then moving on down the list here, we use quarterly progress reports in order to collect data from each grantee on who they're serving and how they are serving their population. That is something that we provided a sample of in your RFP packet, but that is only a sample. We'll be developing quarterly progress reports that are specific to this grant later in the process, and that is something that we would look at the grantee orientation. Travel is allowed under this grant and can be charged to the grant as long as it is consistent with the requirements that are laid out in the RFP. The BSCC has an obligation to ensure that these funds are spent responsibly, and we do have some policies that preclude us from providing grant funds to individuals who have been debarred or convicted of fraud, theft, or embezzlement. There's a specific policy and certification that needs to be signed, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The compliance monitoring visits are something that we routinely conduct for our grantees, and this grant will also be subject to that. So once we have grants that are underway and the projects are actually being implemented, we will come out to your site and conduct monitoring visits in order to see how things are going and to provide any technical assistance that may be. Again, in the packet, there's a sample of the compliance monitoring tool that we use. Okay, and then the last item here is our effective programs and data-driven approaches. And the BSCC strongly encourages all of its grantees to use proven programs. So with this grant also, we want to encourage data-driven approaches and a reliance on programs that have proven to be effective in the past. Okay, so with this next slide then, we're moving into looking at what happens after we receive the proposals. And the first step of that process is for the staff to go through all of the proposals and complete a technical compliance review. So with that technical compliance review, we're looking at things like consistency between the dollar amounts in your narrative and on your budget table. We're looking at the proper signatures, kind of thing. And my mic's sounding weird. Is it still okay? Okay. With that technical compliance review, if we should find that there's a minor non-substantive change that could be made, such as adding a signature, then we normally provide a short period of time for applicants to make those corrections so that their proposal can move forward and be rated. There are two things that will result in automatic disqualification for applicants. The first is if an application is submitted by someone who's not a federally recognized tribe, then they would be disqualified automatically. And the second is if an application comes in after the 5 p.m. March 29th deadline, in that case would also be automatically disqualified. We will provide notifications for both disqualification and in the case where our technical compliance review has identified a minor non-substantive change that can be made. And then in terms of the last bullet on this slide, that moves us into a more detailed look at the rating process that is typically used by our executive steering committees, and in this case by our tribal advisory group. And for this next piece of the process, I'm going to turn it over to Tony Jackson.
Good morning. And starting from this point, once the technical compliance review has been determined and all the applicants have been determined rateable, we then schedule a meeting, which is called a rater training. And we have the ESC come in and we sit down and we give them some training on how to read and rate the proposals. We also go over the weights, which we're going to go over in a couple of minutes. And then after that meeting, we have a final meeting. It's the scoring, reviewing, and funding recommendation meeting. In that meeting, we actually sit down with the ESC and we go over their scores. We go proposal by proposal. The ESC is given an opportunity to discuss their scores. Discuss their scores based on what's discussed at the meeting and what they may or may not have missed in reading and rating the proposals. During that time, if a member determines that they didn't see something in a proposal and another member brought it up, and that member goes back and reviews the proposals, they're given the opportunity to adjust their scores. Once that section of the meeting has been concluded, we go back and we look at the scores. The scores have been adjusted. We recalculate them. Then we start the next section of the meeting by putting up a list of all the proposals in rank order. The ESC then has an opportunity to discuss the rank order. And then based on that rank order, they'll make a recommendation to Kim, the field rep, and then that recommendation will go on to the board. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what goes on. Talk a little bit about if you actually like to look at the rating factors in detail, the rating factors are on page 16 to 24. So in the rating factor table, we have all the rating factors listed. We have the program need, project description, data collection, and the program budget. On this table, it also tells you the weights that were provided, which are the percent of the total value. So in looking at the percents of the total value, this will give you an idea on how to use your page count. So for example, project description was weighted at 50%. So the work group deemed that project description was the most important part of your proposal. The second most important part is the program need. The program need was given 35%, data collection was given 10%, and the program budget was given 5%. Are there any questions regarding the rating table and the weights that were assigned to them?
No online questions.
Okay. Now we'll go on to the next table. This is called the scoring rubric. This table can be found on page 9 in the RFP. The scoring rubric is what the ESC members will use to assign points to the proposals. The scoring rubric is a 5-point scale. We have 1 for poor, 2 for fair, 3 for satisfactory, 4 for good, and 5 for excellent. So what they'll do is when they read the rating factors and the response to the rating factors, and when they assign up points, they'll be assigning points based on this scale. Are there any questions regarding the scoring rubric?
No online questions.
So the next item is preference points. The group decided that there will be 5 points assigned to every application that is a regional application or consortium of tribes. The 5 points will be assigned regardless of whatever score or points you get on your rating factors. Are there any questions regarding the preference points? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. Our organization serves both tribes out of state and state-recognized tribes. Would these participants be ineligible under this program?
Would the non-California tribes be?
A non-California tribe service member. So if they came looking for services and they did meet certain requirements of this grant, would they be ineligible to be served? But for example, if we have a Navajo tribal member.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think I would prefer to take that back and get a definitive answer and get back to you.
Would state-recognized tribes, so California state-recognized tribes, be eligible? Because we do service them under our consortium.
Yes. So you're going to need to have a federally recognized tribe as the primary applicant, but as part of a regional approach, you could have other tribes in California that aren't federally recognized. Does that answer what you were asking? Yeah. Okay. Okay.
We are one tribe with 4 bands and 4 communities. Are we considered a consortium?
Well, I think that since the applicant is the tribe, it's still just going to be, that would be a single applicant. Okay. Any other questions on that? Okay. So with this next slide, you see the reference on the bottom to pages 15 through 22 of the RFP. And really what I want to do with this slide here is just make sure that everyone has a good picture in their mind of the different pieces of the proposal that you need to put together, and especially the page limitations that go with those different components. So the first thing that you'll have is your proposal abstract, and that is limited to 1 page. And then you're going to have your proposal narrative, which will be the biggest part of your proposal. And you have 12 pages for that. But within that 12 pages, you need to cover your program need, your program description, and your plan for data collection. As part of the program description, we're also asking for a project work plan, and that is a separate document that's not included in your 12 pages. So we're asking for 1 to 2 pages for your work plan, and there's a specific template for that. I thought I had written down the page on that. Well, on the very last page of the RFP, there's an example of the project work plan. So you can use 1 to 2 pages depending on how many goals you identify. And again, that project work plan, whether it's 1 page or 2 pages, has no impact on the 12-page narrative that you prepare. Okay, and then the next component of your proposal will be the project budget. And it's important to keep in mind with that project budget that that is going to be a completely separate document. The budget is in Excel, so both the budget table and the budget narrative is all in Excel, and will be submitted at the same time, but in a separate document than the narrative components. And we'll look a little bit more closely at the budget in a minute, but I also want to cover this last bullet here on this slide, and that is additional documents. So the Tribal Advisory Group chose to allow for up to 5 pages of additional documentation. And one of the things that must be included within that 5 pages is a letter of commitment from a partner non-governmental organization that is in support of the proposal and has agreed to work with you in order to make the program successful. So we need the letter of commitment, and then you have up to 4 additional pages to provide additional letters of commitment, if you like, or additional documentation, perhaps charts, graphs, endnotes, things like that, that are in direct support of the program need or program description that you provide in your proposal narrative. Are there any questions on that on the slide we just went over in terms of the different components of the proposal? Mm-hmm.
Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to piggyback a little bit on what Kim said about the endnotes and citing within the document. The ESC members are not to click on any links to get outside information, and so therefore you can cite the document if you're doing data or some sort of information that you want to cite out of a publication, but the ESC members are not allowed to click on those links. So the information you want to provide, you need to provide that in the narrative instead of taking it outside to a link, if that makes sense.
Great reminder, thank you. Okay, so with that, then we are ready to look a little bit more closely at the program budget, since the budget can oftentimes be challenging or perhaps even confusing for people. We have Isabel Diaz, who's going to look at that more closely with us.
Thank you, Kim, and hi again to everyone. So I'll be reviewing the budget attachment. The budget attachment includes the budget table and the budget narrative. And this is all located inside one Excel sheet, which can be accessed in your RFP on page 21. While we go over the budget reminders, we're going to use the handout that we provided. The handout is labeled example in red text. It was next to the sign-in sheet for those that are here in person. And for those that are online, it's the downloadable attachment labeled handout. So I would like to inform you that this is just an example, something that applicants can reference. And the red text is the information that applicants are required to provide. The other text on this template is either locked or it's auto-populated, depending on the information that the applicant provides. So the first thing we would enter is the tribe name.
Hold on one second.
I'm sorry, do we want to bring this document up on the screen for a few people in the room?
Did you grab a copy off the back table? There's a separate copy if you want to grab one real fast.
We can share it on the screen online as well. Do we want to do that?
Oh, okay, good.
Sure, let's share it. Okay. So again, I'm going to start from the beginning. This is just an example, and the red text gives you an idea of what the applicant is required to fill out. We'll start off with where you would enter your name. That's the top of the page. The second area would be the budget line item. This table here auto-populates, and these are the line items that the grantee is limited to. I'm going to move forward and go to the salary and benefits budget table. Here I provide an example. It's Bob Smith, fiscal manager. He makes $60 an hour, 10 hours a month for 12 months. With 22% benefits, we have a total of $8,784. This area here is where you would type in your claims, and then it would auto-populate at the budget line item on top. Please notice that I only used whole dollars. We ask that you do the same. Below the salary and benefits budget table, you will see the salary and benefits narrative. In this area, you would describe how your request will serve to meet your stated goals and objectives for the project. We're still on page 1. So before we go over to page 2, I'm just going to summarize what we reviewed on page 1. The very top where you see a budget line item, this blue area, this auto-populates based on the information you will enter on pages 1 through 5. The salary and benefits table is where you would enter line items, for example, Bob Smith. And the salary and benefits narrative area is where you would describe your claim. Going to page 2. Number 2, services and supplies. I provide an example for printing services, $7.50 a copy for 200 copies, a total of $1,500. Again, here you would provide a narrative for your claim. Number 3, professional services. I provide an example for how you would identify if you do not plan to request funding out of a line item. You are not required to request funding out of every line item. However, we do ask you to type in an NA and a $0 claim. Moving to page 3. Number 4, non-governmental organizations. My example is for mentoring services for youth. Again, you would type in your grant funds, and this would auto-populate, and you would have to provide a narrative. Number 5, equipment and fixed assets. I provided 2 examples, laptop and printer. I did this so that you can notice how you can enter in a new paragraph within the narrative. If we go down to equipment fixed assets narrative, I made a note which states hold down the alternate key and press enter in order to start a new paragraph. Going to page 4. Number 6, data collection, and number 7, project evaluation. Again, you would enter your claims and your dollar amounts and also provide a narrative. I've provided examples, but I will not go into detail. However, you can look back at the examples. Going to page 5. Number 8, other. This is where you can claim travel or training or any other items that do not go into the other line items. I provide an example for mileage, and again, you would have to provide a narrative. Number 9, indirect costs. You have two options here. You have option 1, claim 10% of total direct salaries and wages, or 2, claim 5% of direct total project costs. The table does auto-populate based off claims you have already entered. So as you can see, I went with option 2 and entered grant funds of $1,621. In a minute, Kim will go over details on indirect costs. However, I'd like to mention a few things. We recommend that you access the budget template and the RFP off our website to ensure you have the updated copy. This is an example of the budget you will use to complete year 1, 2, and 3 budget. And again, this handout is only an example, a reference, or a starting point for applicants. So we'll be moving back to the PowerPoint. I'm going to go ahead and wait for the slide to come up. So these next couple slides is just going to summarize what we talked about. This page here is the template, the table that auto-populates, takes the information that the applicant provides in the budget tables. This here is where you can identify each claim for your budget line items. For example, the fiscal manager under salaries and benefits. And this here is the narrative section. I would like to remind you to please explain how your request will serve to meet the goals and objectives for the program. Does anyone have any questions? I don't see any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Kim to go into detail about indirect costs.
Okay, great. Thank you, Isabel. So just looking again at the indirect costs, I know this was just mentioned, but to reiterate, tribal applicants in this grant will have the opportunity to claim indirect costs in 2 different ways. One is by using 10% of their total salaries and wages, or the second option is to use 5% of their project costs, the total project costs. Okay. Okay. And then with these next couple of slides, I just want to go relatively quickly, but go through all of the appendices that you have with this RFP so that you have an idea of what's in front of you. And so starting at the top here, Appendix A is the list of eligible tribes. So again, these are the federally recognized tribes in California. And that starts on page 25. And then Appendix B, you see I have this in red, and I put a few items in red on this slide and the next one, because those are the items where you're actually going to need to complete a form and send that in as part of your proposal package. So the first one here in Appendix B is the non-governmental organization criteria. So we went over all that a few minutes ago, but you will be asked to sign something and include it with your proposal package. So then Appendix C is the glossary, and I encourage everyone to take a look at that glossary that starts on page 33. There are some terms that are defined in a way that's specific to this grant, so I think it's a good idea for everyone to be sure and spend a few minutes with that glossary. And then Appendix D gives some specific examples for the tribal project review plan. So again, this is the plan that we talked about that each grantee will have to prepare up front that lays out how they're going to define their goals and objectives and then assess effectiveness. For Appendix E, we have the full rosters for both the Executive Steering Committee and the Tribal Advisory Group. And Appendix F is a sample grant agreement. So I just want to reiterate here, it is a sample. Each grantee, once they are selected, will work with us. We'll draw up a grant agreement that is specific to each individual that's getting funding, and then that is the document that would contain all of your requirements and that you would sign. Appendix G is the required resolution. And again, this one is in red, so definitely want to take a look at this and make sure that you have a signed governing board or tribal council resolution included with your proposal package. Appendix H is a sample quarterly progress report. And as I mentioned earlier, this is just a sample. We will refine it to meet the specifications of this particular grant, but for now, at least it gives you an idea of what kinds of things we might be asking for. Appendix I is the compliance certification that relates to what we talked about around debarment, fraud, embezzlement, and that is also in red, so an indication that you will need to sign and submit that certification with your proposal package. Appendix J is the sample monitoring tool, and again, that's something that would be used quite a bit later in the process, but just so that everyone knows going into it that for our grantees who receive funding, we do go out and do monitoring, and this is a tool that we are currently using to do that. So, and then appendix, I see there's a typo on my slide here. It's not attachment K, it's actually appendix K. But that is just a listing of evidence-based resources that we routinely provide to our grantees in order to help provide information on what programs and practices are out there that have been shown to be evidence-based. So that is it for the appendices, and then following those appendices, which I think it's actually, the page numbers are wrong at the bottom here, I apologize for that. But it's actually, there are page numbers through 77, which takes us to the end of Appendix K that we just talked about. And then starting on the next page, the next 7 pages are the actual proposal package that you'll be submitting. So you have the cover sheet there, and then the next page is the proposal checklist. And I really encourage everyone to look at that proposal checklist now. It's a really handy one-page guide for showing you everything that you're going to need to submit to us, as well as all the page limits and the documents that need to be signed. Following the checklist, you have the applicant information form, and that's pretty self-explanatory, but it is a mandatory piece of the proposal and needs to come to us with your proposal, and it needs to be signed. And then the last page, we have the proposal narrative, and again, this one pager here just kind of shows you in a snapshot all the different components of your proposal, which include the abstract, the narrative, and the budget. And the additional documents. And then the final bullet here, as a reminder, that budget is required as part of your proposal package, but it's in a separate document. And that takes us to the next slide, which is just to go over some key dates. So again, as we talked about earlier, I am asking for letters of intent by February 20th. However, I would appreciate getting them even if they're a little bit after that date. And then, of course, the proposals are due by 5 p.m. on March 29th. After we receive those proposals, we'll be conducting our proposal rating process and the development of the funding recommendations during April and May. And then it is my hope and my plan to present the recommendations for funding that come from our tribal advisory group to present those to our BSCC board for their consideration and approval at their June 13th meeting. And then that would put us in a position to begin funding the new grants by July 1st of this year. And with that, we would be ready to provide the grantee orientation to all of our new grantees in late September or I'm sorry, in late August or in September of this year. Are there any questions on any of that? Yeah.
Hi, so we're a consortium of about the 60 of the tribes that you guys listed, but we are registered as a NGO. Would one of the tribes need to submit the application for us and list us as a subcontractor? Or
Yes, the application will need to come from a tribe. Doesn't look like we have any questions on the live stream. Do we have any other questions in the room? All right, then I will just do one more reminder that proposals are due March 29th at 9 p.m. Those proposals should be submitted in terms of the electronic copies to our dedicated mailbox, which is Youth Reinvestment Grant at bscc.ca.gov. And you may also submit any questions you have to that mailbox. We will be responding to questions throughout the proposal or throughout this time period before the proposals are due. And we will be updating our online FAQs periodically and posting updates as we have them to the BSCC website. And that concludes our presentation, unless there are any other questions. Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Sarah, for being here. Thank you to those online, and we hope that this was helpful. Right. Very good.